Imagine a world where the wind simply stops. It's a strange thought because wind is such a constant part of our daily lives. From the cool breezes that provide relief on a hot summer day, to the powerful gusts that turn the blades of wind turbines, wind is more than just air in motion. It's a driving force of life on Earth. But what would really happen if, for one whole year, the planet experienced absolute stillness? Let's dive into the foundations of what wind does for us and why its absence would be catastrophic. Wind isn't just a pleasant or sometimes annoying phenomenon. It's a crucial component of the Earth's climate system. It occurs because of differences in air pressure created when the sun heats the Earth's surface unevenly. Warm air rises, cooler air rushes in to take its place, and voila, wind is born. This natural movement of air helps distribute heat across the planet, moderating temperatures and preventing extreme conditions in most areas. Without it, regions that are already warm would become unbearably hot, and colder areas would plunge into bitter cold. The movement of wind also drives the water cycle. As air currents pass over bodies of water, they pick up moisture, forming clouds that travel across landscapes to release rain. Without wind, this cycle would grind to a halt. Rain would become irregular, leaving some areas in prolonged drought, while others could experience stagnant, oppressive humidity. This would severely impact agriculture, ecosystems, and even our drinking water supplies. Let's not forget how vital wind is for maintaining air quality. In cities and industrial areas, pollutants in the air are constantly being dispersed and carried away by the wind. In a windless world, these pollutants would settle and linger, creating a toxic atmosphere. This isn't just a hypothetical problem. There are real-life examples. In 1952, London experienced what is now called the Great Smog, where stagnant air trapped pollutants over the city for days, leading to thousands of deaths. Now imagine a similar scenario lasting for an entire year on a global scale. Wind also plays a major role in supporting ecosystems. Seeds, pollen, and spores are carried by the wind, allowing plants to reproduce and ecosystems to thrive. Without wind, the natural spread of plant life would come to a halt, leading to a domino effect across food chains. Birds, insects, and animals that rely on these plants would be affected, potentially triggering massive die-offs. On top of this, wind drives ocean currents. These currents are essential for regulating global temperatures and supporting marine ecosystems. If wind stopped, ocean temperatures would become unbalanced, with warm waters stagnating in some areas and colder waters in others. This would disrupt marine life on an unprecedented scale, affecting everything from coral reefs to the fishing industry. This hypothetical scenario already sounds daunting, and we're just scratching the surface of the changes that a year without wind would bring. It's clear that wind isn't just a backdrop to our lives, it's a critical player in maintaining balance on our planet. In the next part, we'll explore how the absence of wind would begin to disrupt our daily lives and infrastructure within days and weeks, unraveling systems we've built to depend on its presence. As the days turn into weeks without wind, the effects on our daily lives and the systems we rely on would become impossible to ignore. One of the first noticeable changes would be the oppressive stillness in the air. Without even the smallest breeze, cities and towns would feel unnaturally quiet. The absence of background noise like rustling leaves or howling gusts, creating an eerie atmosphere. But this unsettling calm would quickly give way to more serious problems. Temperatures would start to spiral out of control. In urban areas, where concrete and asphalt trap heat, the lack of air circulation would turn cities into virtual ovens during the summer. Without wind to carry cooler air or dissipate heat, temperatures could rise by several degrees, pushing already hot regions into dangerous territory. Heat waves, like the infamous European heat wave of 2003, which claimed tens of thousands of lives, would become more common and prolonged. Vulnerable populations, such as the elderly and those with pre-existing health conditions, would bear the brunt of these extreme conditions. In colder months, the story would flip, especially in regions that depend on wind-driven weather patterns to circulate warmer air. Without wind, frigid temperatures would settle in, creating prolonged and severe cold spells. Heating systems would be pushed to their limits, leading to energy shortages and even blackouts in areas unprepared for such sustained demand. Transportation would face significant hurdles. Wind plays a vital role in air travel, providing the lift airplanes need to fly efficiently and the tailwinds that help reduce fuel consumption. Without wind, flight patterns would need to be completely restructured, increasing travel times and fuel usage dramatically. Turbulence caused by air movement would no longer be an issue, But that small silver lining would pale in comparison to the logistical and economic disruptions in global travel. Oceanic transport would also grind to a near halt. Sailboats and other vessels that rely on wind would become obsolete, and even modern ships, which depend on currents influenced by wind, would face delays and increased fuel consumption. Shipping costs would skyrocket, affecting the global supply chain and driving up the price of goods. Energy production would be another major casualty. Wind power, which accounts for a growing percentage of global electricity, around 7% as of the early 2020s, would disappear entirely. Countries like Denmark and Germany, which rely heavily on wind energy, would experience immediate shortages, while other energy sources like coal, natural gas, and nuclear could temporarily fill the gap. The increased demand would strain these systems, potentially leading to rolling blackouts and widespread outages. Farming and agriculture would face devastating challenges. Wind is crucial for pollination, especially for crops like wheat, corn, and fruit trees. In its absence, farmers would need to turn to manual pollination, an extremely labor-intensive and costly process. Crop yields would plummet, leading to food shortages and skyrocketing prices. Irrigation systems, too, would suffer without wind to help distribute water evenly across fields. These impacts would quickly extend beyond individual cities and countries, becoming a global crisis. Supply chains would break down, access to essential resources like food and fuel would dwindle, and the interconnected nature of the modern world would magnify the fallout. By the end of just a few weeks without wind, society would already be grappling with widespread disruptions. But as the months wore on, the effects would deepen, threatening ecosystems and the very fabric of life on Earth. In the next part, we'll delve into how the absence of wind would ripple through nature, disrupting ecosystems, wildlife, and the delicate balance of life itself. As weeks without wind turn into months, the impact on Earth's ecosystems and wildlife would be devastating. Wind is more than just moving air. It's a critical component of the natural world, influencing how life thrives across land, sea, and sky. Without it, the interconnected balance of ecosystems would unravel, leaving widespread destruction in its wake. One of the most immediate effects would be on plant life. Wind plays a crucial role in spreading seeds, pollen, and spores, allowing plants to reproduce and expand into new areas. Without this natural dispersal mechanism, many plants would struggle to survive. Species that rely heavily on wind for pollination, like grasses, grains, and some trees, would see dramatic declines. This would cascade through the food chain as herbivores that depend on these plants for sustenance would face starvation. Aquatic ecosystems would also suffer. Wind drives the surface currents of oceans and lakes, which are vital for mixing water layers. This mixing helps distribute oxygen and nutrients throughout the water, supporting marine life at all levels. Without wind, these currents would weaken, causing oxygen levels in deeper waters to drop. This process, known as hypoxia, could lead to massive die-offs of fish, shellfish, and other aquatic organisms. Fisheries, which provide a primary source of protein for millions of people worldwide, would collapse, exacerbating food shortages already triggered by agricultural declines. The absence of wind would also disrupt weather patterns, further stressing ecosystems. Rainfall would become more localized and uneven, leading to prolonged droughts in some areas and flooding in others. This would devastate habitats as animals and plants struggle to adapt to the unpredictable conditions. Forests, for instance, would be particularly vulnerable. Without wind to carry moisture-laden air from oceans to land, many regions would see a sharp decline in rainfall, causing forests to wither and increasing the risk of wildfires. Wildlife would face immense challenges in this new, still world. Birds, which often rely on the wind currents to conserve energy during migration, would struggle to complete their long journeys. Many species would abandon their migration routes altogether, disrupting breeding cycles and leading to population declines. Insects, such as bees and butterflies, would also suffer as they use wind cues to navigate and find food. The loss of these critical pollinators would further exacerbate the decline in plant diversity and agricultural output. Even the smallest creatures, like microorganisms, would be affected. Tiny particles and organisms that travel through the air, including beneficial bacteria and fungal spores, would no longer disperse effectively. This would impact soil health, as these organisms play a key role in breaking down organic matter and cycling nutrients. Poor soil quality would further hinder plant growth, creating a vicious cycle of decline. predators, scavengers, and other higher-level animals would feel the ripple effects of these changes. As prey species decline due to habitat loss and food shortages, predators would face starvation. Entire food webs would begin to collapse, leading to extinctions across multiple species. Coastal ecosystems would be particularly hard hit, as the loss of wind-driven upwelling, a process that brings nutrient-rich water to the surface, would disrupt marine food chains, from plankton to top predators like whales. The silence of a windless world would also have psychological effects on humans and animals alike. The rustling of leaves, the whispers of grass, and the distant howl of the wind are constant, comforting background sounds that have existed for as long as life on Earth. Their absence would create an unsettling stillness, amplifying the sense of isolation and vulnerability. As ecosystems falter and wildlife populations plummet, humanity's dependence on the natural world would become starkly apparent. In the final part, we'll explore how the long-term absence of wind would reshape human civilization, altering the course of our future in profound and irreversible ways. As a year without wind stretches into its final months, the consequences for human civilization would become stark and unavoidable. Our way of life, which depends so heavily on wind-driven systems, would be forced into a desperate struggle for adaptation and survival. One of the most immediate challenges would be energy production. Wind power accounts for roughly 7% of global electricity generation, but the effects of a windless world go beyond just renewable energy. Thermal power plants, including coal, gas, and nuclear facilities, rely on cooling towers that depend on air movement to dissipate heat. Without wind, these plants would risk overheating and shutting down, leading to widespread blackouts. Solar energy systems would also face challenges, as the lack of wind could create localized heat pockets that reduce efficiency. With power grids under strain or completely failing, access to electricity would become a luxury, disrupting communication, healthcare, and essential services. Transportation systems would be fundamentally altered. Airplanes, which rely on wind for lift and stability, would face reduced performance or grounding altogether. Shipping would slow dramatically as windless seas make it harder for vessels to move efficiently. The global supply chain, already under pressure from reduced agricultural and industrial productivity, would grind to a halt, leading to shortages of food, medicine, and other vital goods. Communities that rely on imported resources would be hit the hardest, with many descending into crises of scarcity. Economic systems would be in turmoil as industries collapsed. Tourism, an economic lifeline for many regions, would dwindle. Iconic natural landscapes like deserts and forests, whose beauty is often tied to wind-sculpted features, would begin to degrade, leaving once vibrant ecosystems barren and lifeless. Coastal areas, which depend on consistent wind patterns for fishing and recreation, would see their livelihoods vanish. Entire sectors such as wind farming, aviation, and maritime trade would cease to exist, forcing millions into unemployment and poverty. Health crises would escalate further. The air, thick with pollutants that would otherwise be dispersed by the wind, would turn cities into hazardous zones. Chronic respiratory illnesses, heart conditions, and other health problems would rise to unprecedented levels. Hospitals, already overburdened by power shortages and failing supply chains, would struggle to meet the growing demand for care. In some regions, heat waves and extreme cold would exacerbate existing vulnerabilities, leading to mass casualties. The psychological toll on humanity would be profound. The absence of wind would bring about an eerie stillness that many would find unsettling. Gone would be the gentle rustle of leaves or the refreshing breeze on a hot day, sounds and sensations we take for granted. The world would feel oppressively quiet, amplifying feelings of isolation and despair. Social unrest would likely follow as communities grapple with resource shortages, collapsing infrastructures, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. As time passed, adaptation would become the only option. Cities might begin investing in artificial systems to replicate wind's natural functions. Enormous fans or mechanical air circulation systems could be deployed in urban areas to improve air quality and cool buildings. Desalination plants and irrigation systems would have to expand massively to address water shortages caused by altered weather patterns. New technologies such as drone pollinators might help mitigate the collapse of natural pollination. However, these solutions would be expensive, energy-intensive, and available only to the wealthiest nations, deepening the divide between the global rich and poor. Human migration would become a defining feature of this windless year. Coastal communities would retreat inland due to rising sea temperatures and ecosystem collapse. Residents of heat-stricken cities would flee to cooler regions, creating unprecedented waves of climate refugees. Governments would face immense pressure to manage these migrations, leading to geopolitical tensions and conflicts over resources and territory. By the end of the year, the world would look unrecognizably different. Societies would be left grappling with not just the practical consequences of a year without wind, but also the psychological realization of just how much we depend on natural systems we cannot control. This hypothetical scenario highlights the delicate balance that sustains life on Earth, reminding us of the profound interconnectedness of our planet's ecosystems. In the face of such a catastrophic change, humanity's resilience would be tested to its limits. The question is not just whether we could survive, but what kind of world we would emerge into. A humbling reflection on the forces of nature we often take for granted. Yellowstone National Park is home to one of the most dangerous and awe-inspiring natural wonders in the world, a supervolcano. It's not just any volcano, it's a massive geological feature sitting quietly under the surface, with the potential to cause an event so catastrophic it could change life as we know it. This supervolcano has been dormant for thousands of years, but beneath the surface there's constant movement. Magma is churning, pressures are building, and every now and then, scientists see signs that something is brewing. While we don't know exactly when it will erupt, we know that it's still an active and volatile system, and experts warn that we are overdue for an eruption. If Yellowstone were to erupt tomorrow, the immediate effects would be so intense and destructive, it would feel like a disaster movie come to life. The eruption would likely begin with a massive earthquake as magma rises toward the surface, shaking the land and sending a tremor through the region. That earthquake would be followed by an eruption of unimaginable power. The skies would quickly darken as a massive ash cloud began to billow into the atmosphere. This cloud could stretch thousands of miles, covering much of the United States and beyond. The ash would block out sunlight, creating an eerie, apocalyptic atmosphere that would make it seem like day had turned to night. The ash fallout would have immediate and devastating consequences for the environment and human life. Cities like Denver, Salt Lake City, and even further parts of the country would be buried under layers of ash, disrupting air traffic, causing buildings to collapse under the weight, and making it incredibly dangerous to breathe. Respiratory problems would become widespread as fine ash particles filled the air, while the agriculture sector would face total destruction. Crops would be destroyed and livestock would perish, leading to food shortages and economic collapse. And at the same time, pyroclastic flows, which are fast-moving superheated gas and rock avalanches, would begin to flow out of the volcano at deadly speeds. These flows would travel for miles, scorching everything in their path. The heat would be so intense that it could melt the asphalt on roads, turning even the most ordinary routes into death traps for anyone trying to escape. As the flows move, toxic gases would be released into the air, further polluting the environment and making survival even more difficult. These pyroclastic flows would continue to spread, decimating the landscape and causing even more destruction. Imagine seeing an entire region being transformed into a hellish landscape, a world where everything is set on fire and nothing survives. The eruption's effects wouldn't be limited to just the areas surrounding Yellowstone. One of the most alarming impacts would be the potential for global cooling. The vast amount of ash and sulfuric gases released into the atmosphere would block out sunlight for months, or possibly even years. This could lead to what scientists call a volcanic winter. Temperatures around the world would plummet and the weather patterns would be completely disrupted. This global cooling would have a disastrous effect on crops, leading to widespread famine and food shortages. The Earth's climate would struggle to recover and the ripple effects would be felt in nearly every country. The economic impact would be almost beyond comprehension. The global economy relies on trade, and with airports closed, roads destroyed, and communication lines down, the movement of goods would be severely disrupted, markets would crash, and countries would face severe financial strain. Many nations would find themselves unable to deal with the economic fallout, and some might even face bankruptcy. The agricultural collapse would be devastating not just in the United States, but around the world. The financial losses would be astronomical, and rebuilding would take decades, if not longer. This is the kind of destruction that scientists have been warning about for years. While it's not certain when or if this eruption will occur, it's clear that the supervolcano beneath Yellowstone remains active. And when it finally erupts, the consequences could be far-reaching and catastrophic. The world as we know it could be completely changed by a single event. This is why it's so important to understand what Yellowstone could do and to start thinking about how we can prepare for something that, though unlikely to happen tomorrow, is still a real and possible threat. Now that we understand just how destructive a Yellowstone eruption would be, let's dig deeper into the scientific side of it. What makes this supervolcano so dangerous, and why is it considered such a threat? To start, Yellowstone is not a single volcano, but a giant volcanic system that sits on top of a hotspot in the Earth's crust. This hotspot allows magma from deep within the Earth to rise toward the surface, and over millions of years, it has created what we now know as the Yellowstone caldera, which is essentially the largest active volcanic system in North America. The key to understanding the scale of a potential eruption lies in its geological history. Yellowstone has erupted 3 times in the past 2.1 million years, with each eruption being more powerful than the last. The most recent eruption occurred around 640,000 years ago, and it was so massive that it blanketed much of the western United States in ash. That eruption was what scientists refer to as a super eruption, capable of unleashing energy equivalent to thousands of atomic bombs going off at once. While the eruptions weren't constant, the caldera has shown ongoing signs of activity, and that's what makes Yellowstone so volatile. One of the most unsettling things about Yellowstone is that scientists have found evidence of continuous seismic activity, which means that the ground is constantly shifting. This ongoing ground deformation indicates that magma is still moving beneath the surface, causing pressure to build. The U.S. Geological Survey and other scientific organizations closely monitor these changes, watching for any signs of unusual volcanic activity. Despite this constant monitoring, however, we can't predict exactly when an eruption will occur. It could happen tomorrow, next year, or even 1,000 years from now, but what is certain is that Yellowstone is still active, and one day it could erupt once again. What would an eruption like this look like from a geological standpoint? The magma chamber beneath Yellowstone contains an enormous amount of magma, much more than typical volcanoes. If this magma were to rise rapidly to the surface, it would cause the ground to crack open. The immediate eruption would start with a violent explosion, sending a colossal amount of ash and gas into the air, potentially reaching altitudes that could affect the global atmosphere. At the same time, lava would pour from the caldera, creating rivers of molten rock that would flow for miles, scorching everything in their path. The sheer volume of material ejected during a Yellowstone eruption is mind-boggling. It's believed that the eruption could send hundreds of cubic kilometers of ash, lava, and volcanic gases into the atmosphere. To give you an idea of how massive this would be, a typical volcanic eruption releases a few million cubic meters of magma, but a Yellowstone super eruption could release more than 1,000 times that amount. This is what makes Yellowstone such a dangerous and unpredictable force in nature. The sheer scale of its potential eruption could dwarf anything we've ever seen in recorded history. In addition to the direct effects of an eruption, another issue would be the ongoing environmental changes that would follow. The ash alone would be enough to alter weather patterns for years. The global cooling effect, often referred to as volcanic winter, could cause temperatures to drop significantly, leading to frost and snow even in the middle of summer. This kind of climate change would lead to massive disruptions in the natural world. Ecosystems would be severely impacted, with plant and animal life struggling to survive in an altered environment. The global food supply would be in danger as crops would fail due to the lack of sunlight and sudden drops in temperature. This environmental shift would not only impact agriculture but also human health. The ash in the air would make it difficult to breathe, and the toxic gases like sulfur dioxide could cause widespread respiratory problems. Even if people managed to escape the immediate impact zone, the effects of the eruption would continue to affect them no matter where they went. These gases could cause acid rain, poisoning bodies of water, and further destroying the landscape. Yellowstone's eruption would also put major stress on the global economy. Countries would face immense financial difficulties as they tried to deal with the aftermath. The eruption would likely take out entire regions of infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and electrical grids. This would make it impossible for many areas to function normally. Airports would be shut down, making it nearly impossible to fly anywhere. Cities would be cut off, and it would be difficult to deliver aid to affected areas. Global supply chains would collapse, and businesses would struggle to recover, leading to widespread economic hardship. This kind of catastrophic event could take years to recover from, and some areas might never fully return to normal. The risks associated with Yellowstone are not just theoretical. They are very real, and it's something we must prepare for. While scientists continue to monitor the area, there's no way to predict exactly when the eruption might occur. What we do know is that the signs are there, and we need to be aware of what could happen if that time comes. Being prepared means understanding the scale of the threat, the environmental impact, and the potential consequences of such a devastating event. As we continue to explore the potential effects of a Yellowstone eruption, it's important to focus on the immediate aftermath and the challenges humanity would face in the wake of such an event. What happens after the eruption? What would the world look like, and how would society respond to this unprecedented disaster? First, we need to understand how the landscape itself would be transformed. The eruption would be so catastrophic that the area around Yellowstone would be left nearly unrecognizable. A massive crater would form where the caldera used to be, and the ground itself would collapse, creating a huge depression in the Earth's crust. This massive void would change the geography of the region, and rivers, lakes, and forests would be forever altered. The eruption would not just affect Yellowstone National Park, it would change the entire surrounding area, possibly affecting as much as half of the United States. One of the most immediate threats would be the ash fallout. This ash would blanket the landscape for hundreds of miles, severely impacting infrastructure and making everyday life nearly impossible. Imagine entire cities buried under inches or even feet of ash. Roads would be impassable, and buildings would collapse under the weight. Ash would clog machinery, including cars and aircraft, making transportation nearly impossible. It would even be dangerous to breathe, as the fine particles would cause severe respiratory issues for anyone caught in the fallout. For those who survived the initial explosion, they would now be facing an environment that is toxic and suffocating. One of the greatest challenges would be the massive number of displaced people. Cities and towns across the affected regions would be evacuated, as the ash would make it impossible to live or work in those areas. This could lead to a mass exodus, with millions of people trying to find safety in other regions. However, with transportation systems destroyed and the roads blocked, movement would be extremely difficult. Temporary shelters would be set up in less affected areas, but these would quickly become overwhelmed, leading to overcrowded conditions and shortages of food, water, and medical supplies. Humanitarian aid would be essential, but getting help to those who need it would be incredibly challenging due to the disrupted infrastructure. The economic impact of the eruption would also be catastrophic. Trade routes, both domestic and international, would be completely disrupted. The ash cloud would block out sunlight, causing crop failures around the world. This would lead to widespread food shortages, especially in countries that rely on American exports. Global economies would be plunged into turmoil, and many countries could face a complete collapse. The damage to the environment, infrastructure, and economy would take years, even decades, to recover from. The climate would change dramatically as well. With the massive amounts of ash and sulfur dioxide released into the atmosphere, a phenomenon known as volcanic winter would take hold. This would cause temperatures to drop significantly around the world. For a time, the Earth's climate could cool by several degrees, which would have devastating consequences for agriculture. Short growing seasons, colder temperatures, and altered precipitation patterns would cause crop failures and make it harder to produce enough food to feed the global population. The cooling effect could last for months or even years, making it difficult for humans to adapt and survive. As the world deals with these dramatic environmental and societal changes, governments and organizations would be scrambling to respond. Emergency services would be overwhelmed, and it's uncertain whether they would be able to reach all affected areas. Even if rescue and relief efforts were successful in some regions, many areas would be left to fend for themselves. In some places, emergency crews might be unable to reach those in need due to blocked roads, destroyed buildings, or hazardous conditions. The sheer scale of the eruption would make it incredibly difficult to mount an organized response, and without communication lines, coordination would be nearly impossible. In the wake of such destruction, society would have to adjust to a new normal. With the economy shattered and the environment severely impacted, life as we know it would fundamentally change. The social fabric would be tested as people scramble to survive, and communities would need to come together to rebuild what was lost. Governments would face enormous challenges in managing the recovery process. Resources would be scarce, and the long-term environmental damage could affect generations to come. What's clear is that the eruption of Yellowstone would not just be a natural disaster, it would be a global crisis that would reshape the course of human history. What would be the psychological and emotional toll on people? It's hard to imagine the level of trauma that would follow such an event. The loss of loved ones, homes, and entire communities would be heartbreaking. people would be forced to confront not only the immediate devastation, but also the long-term effects of living in a world drastically changed. The constant uncertainty about when or if life will ever return to normal would create widespread anxiety and stress. It's difficult to say how people would cope with the aftermath of something so overwhelming, but the survival instinct would likely push many to keep going. Even in the face of the most dire circumstances, the aftermath of a Yellowstone eruption would be far more than just a natural disaster. It would be an event of such immense scale that it would challenge the very survival of humanity. From the immediate environmental destruction to the long-term societal and economic consequences, the world would be irrevocably changed. As we reach the final part of this exploration into the hypothetical eruption of Yellowstone, it's important to reflect on how the world might eventually recover. Although the scale of the disaster would be unprecedented, humanity has always shown remarkable resilience in the face of catastrophe. In this part, we'll look at the potential paths to recovery and what steps would need to be taken to adapt to a drastically changed world. And one of the most pressing challenges would be rebuilding the global infrastructure. After the eruption, communication systems would be down, electricity grids would be destroyed, and many roads would be impassable due to ash, lava, and the collapse of structures. The immediate aftermath would be chaotic, with governments and organizations trying to re-establish order and get aid to the people who need it most. While recovery would be slow, it's possible that technological advancements could help speed up the process. In the years following the eruption, nations might work together to rebuild their infrastructures, focusing on alternative energy sources and more resilient designs for homes and cities. The goal would be to create a more sustainable and adaptable society that could withstand future natural disasters. The environmental recovery would be just as crucial but far more difficult. The volcanic winter caused by the eruption would cause crops to fail globally, leading to food shortages. In the months and years following the eruption, scientists would be studying the effects on the atmosphere, climate, and ecosystems. It's likely that agriculture would need to be radically transformed. Traditional farming methods might be replaced with new techniques that are more resistant to the harsh conditions created by the eruption. Vertical farming, genetically modified crops, and innovations in food production could become critical to feeding a world that is struggling with crop failures. Additionally, efforts to restore ecosystems damaged by ash and pyroclastic flows would be essential, but the recovery of forests, rivers, and wildlife could take decades, even centuries. Another area that would need significant attention is the psychological impact of such a disaster. The eruption of Yellowstone would not just be a physical disaster, but a psychological one as well. People around the world would be dealing with grief, trauma, and fear, as entire communities and cultures might be wiped out. In the aftermath, mental health support would be essential to help individuals and families cope with the emotional toll of the disaster. The loss of homes, loved ones, and the familiar world would require extensive counseling, therapy, and community rebuilding. Over time, people would need to find hope and purpose in the midst of devastation, and mental health organizations would be on the front lines, helping people adjust to the new reality. The global economy would eventually need to stabilize as well, although this would take time. The eruption would disrupt global trade, cause widespread unemployment, and leave economies in ruins. But history has shown that economies can recover, albeit slowly. A focus on sustainable development and rebuilding industries would be key to long-term recovery. New markets would likely emerge, such as those focused on clean energy and technologies to mitigate future disasters. Countries that are able to adapt to the new environmental conditions and work together in rebuilding global supply chains may be able to bounce back more quickly. However, the global community would need to reimagine the way we operate as a species, moving away from reliance on fossil fuels, for example, and focus on creating systems that can withstand future challenges. In the face of all these challenges, one of the greatest opportunities for recovery would lie in international cooperation. The eruption of Yellowstone would affect the entire globe, and no single nation would be able to recover alone. In fact, the scale of the disaster would make global cooperation essential. Countries would need to share resources, information, and expertise to rebuild and adapt to the new environmental realities. While the eruption could strain international relationships, it could also serve as a wake-up call, pushing nations to collaborate in ways they never have before. Together, we would have to tackle the issue of climate change head-on, learn from past mistakes, and build a future that is more resilient to natural disasters. As humanity slowly adapts to life in a post-Yellowstone world, one thing would be certain: The eruption would leave an indelible mark on our collective consciousness. We would likely come to view the world differently, more fragile, more interconnected, and more in need of careful stewardship. The disaster would remind us of how vulnerable we are to the forces of nature, but also of our incredible ability to rebuild and rise from the ashes. In the end, the recovery from a Yellowstone eruption would be one of the greatest challenges humanity has ever faced. It would test our survival instincts, our ability to adapt, and our willingness to come together as a global community. The consequences of such an event would ripple through history for generations to come, but with perseverance and innovation, life could eventually return to something resembling normalcy. What's clear is that the world would never be the same again, and humanity would have to learn from this catastrophic event to build a more sustainable, resilient future for ourselves and future generations. Thanks for sticking with me through this wild journey into the world of Yellowstone and what would happen if it erupted tomorrow. I hope this scenario has sparked your curiosity about the potential impacts of natural disasters. Let me know in the comments how you would prepare for such an event. And as always, don't forget to check out my other videos on natural disasters and emergency preparedness. You never know what might be next. Imagine waking up one morning to an Earth completely transformed. The oceans, which span more than 70% of the planet's surface, have frozen solid overnight. This isn't just a simple wintertime freeze, it's an apocalyptic transformation with far-reaching consequences. To truly grasp how life on Earth would change under these circumstances, we need to start by understanding the vital role oceans play in maintaining our planet's delicate balance. The oceans are far more than vast bodies of water. They are the engine that keeps our planet alive. By absorbing and redistributing heat from the sun, oceans regulate global temperatures and drive weather patterns. Without them, the Earth's climate system would be thrown into chaos. Their currents act like conveyor belts, moving warm water from the equator to the poles and circulating colder water back. This continuous motion ensures relatively stable temperatures around the globe, allowing ecosystems to thrive. If all the oceans froze overnight, this heat distribution would stop immediately. The equator, no longer cooled by ocean currents, would become unbearably hot. Meanwhile, regions farther from the equator would experience extreme and relentless cold. Weather patterns that we've come to recognize, such as predictable rain seasons or coastal breezes, would vanish, replaced by erratic and destructive storms. The visual of frozen oceans alone is enough to inspire awe and dread. From horizon to horizon, sheets of ice would stretch endlessly, reflecting sunlight instead of absorbing it. This would accelerate global cooling, as ice is far more reflective than water. Known as the albedo effect, this feedback loop could quickly plunge the planet into a deep freeze, turning even the most temperate regions into icy wastelands. One of the first and most profound impacts of frozen oceans would be on marine life. Oceans are teeming with biodiversity, from microscopic plankton to massive whales. These organisms depend on liquid water for survival. Plankton, which form the base of the oceanic food chain, would vanish almost immediately, triggering a cascade of extinctions. Marine ecosystems, built over millions of years, would collapse in an instant. In addition to marine life, the freezing of the oceans would directly impact the air we breathe. Phytoplankton, tiny organisms that live near the ocean's surface, produce about half of the oxygen in Earth's atmosphere through photosynthesis. With the oceans frozen and these organisms wiped out, oxygen levels would begin to decline, making survival even more challenging for land-dwelling creatures, including humans. This chilling scenario of frozen oceans sets the stage for even greater challenges that humanity would face. In the next part, we'll explore the domino effect this event would have on human societies, economies, and the planet's ecosystems. From food supply chains to the collapse of global trade, the repercussions of this catastrophic event would redefine life as we know it. With the oceans frozen solid, the cascading effects on human society would be nothing short of catastrophic. Almost overnight, the systems and infrastructure we rely on daily would begin to unravel, leaving humanity in a state of unprecedented crisis. Let's delve deeper into how this frozen world would transform our lives in ways we've never imagined. One of the immediate consequences would be the collapse of the global food supply. Oceans are not only home to marine life, but also a cornerstone of human sustenance. Over 3 billion people worldwide depend on seafood as their primary source of protein. Entire fishing industries would be obliterated, leaving communities that rely on the ocean for food and livelihood in desperate circumstances. But the impact doesn't stop there. Ocean-based economies, which include industries like tourism, shipping, and aquaculture, contribute trillions of dollars annually to the global economy. With the oceans frozen, these industries would grind to a halt, leading to mass unemployment and economic collapse. Global trade, which relies heavily on ocean transportation, would face an unprecedented crisis. Over 90% of the world's goods are transported by sea, from essential food and medical supplies to raw materials used in manufacturing. Without navigable oceans, ships would remain immobilized in ports, causing supply chains to fracture. Nations that rely on imports to sustain their populations would face severe shortages of essential goods, plunging millions into poverty and hunger. As if these challenges weren't enough, the Earth's climate would spiral into further chaos. With the oceans frozen, the planet's ability to absorb and moderate carbon dioxide levels would cease entirely. The oceans currently act as one of the largest carbon sinks, absorbing nearly 1/3 of all human-produced carbon dioxide. Without this mechanism, greenhouse gases would remain trapped in the atmosphere, amplifying the effects of climate change. Paradoxically, while the surface would freeze, atmospheric conditions could become increasingly volatile, with extreme storms and weather anomalies wreaking havoc across the globe. This drastic change would also disrupt freshwater availability. Over 2/3 of the Earth's freshwater supply is tied to the hydrological cycle, which depends on the continuous evaporation and precipitation facilitated by oceans. A frozen ocean would halt this cycle, leading to severe droughts in some regions and devastating floods in others, as weather patterns shift unpredictably. Major rivers and lakes that rely on consistent precipitation would dry up, further threatening water supplies for drinking, agriculture, and industry. In this frozen reality, life for humans would become increasingly fragile. Crops would struggle to grow in the harsh new climate, and the soil, deprived of consistent moisture, would lose its fertility. Agricultural yields would plummet, and nations around the globe would face widespread food shortages. Social unrest would likely erupt as communities fought over dwindling resources, leading to instability and conflict on a global scale. The interconnectedness of our world means that a frozen ocean would ripple through every aspect of life, revealing just how much humanity depends on the stability of our planet's natural systems. As we've now explored the immediate societal impacts, the next part will delve into the long-term environmental changes and the grim reality of adapting to a planet where the oceans remain frozen. The long-term environmental impacts of frozen oceans would reshape Earth into a world nearly unrecognizable from the one we know. Over time, the planet's ecosystems and climates would adapt, or collapse, under the weight of this unprecedented change, setting off a chain reaction of consequences that would ripple through every aspect of the natural world. Let's explore how life on Earth would attempt to survive and the new challenges that would arise. A critical issue would be the disruption of the ocean's role in regulating the planet's temperature. In our current world, ocean currents act like massive conveyor belts, moving warm water from the equator toward the poles and colder water back toward the equator. This system, called thermohaline circulation, helps stabilize global temperatures. Without liquid oceans, this essential process would stop entirely. Regions near the equator would become unbearably hot, while areas closer to the poles would sink into perpetual deep freeze. This stark temperature divide would make large parts of the planet uninhabitable for both humans and wildlife. The extinction crisis that began immediately after the oceans froze would intensify over the years. Entire marine ecosystems would have already been wiped out, but the absence of these ecosystems would start to affect terrestrial life as well. Coastal habitats, which support diverse wildlife and vegetation, would be obliterated as frozen oceans encroach on land. Species that depend on these habitats, from seabirds to coastal predators, would face extinction without access to food or viable nesting areas. The loss of biodiversity would create ripple effects throughout the food web, destabilizing ecosystems on a massive scale. On land, ecosystems would struggle to adapt to the new climate conditions. Forests, grasslands, and wetlands are all intricately linked to the water cycle, which would be profoundly altered by the absence of liquid oceans. Rainfall patterns would become erratic and extreme, creating vast deserts in some regions and excessive flooding in others. Vegetation that depends on consistent rainfall, like crops and forests, would begin to die off, leading to soil erosion and desertification. The loss of plant life would reduce the planet's ability to absorb carbon dioxide, further exacerbating atmospheric instability. The frozen oceans would also create physical challenges for the planet itself. Ice expands as it forms, so the vast expanses of frozen water would begin exerting immense pressure on the Earth's crust. This could lead to an increase in seismic and volcanic activity as the planet adjusts to the added stress. Earthquakes might become more frequent and more severe, while dormant volcanoes could erupt unexpectedly. These geological events would add yet another layer of destruction to an already struggling world. Human attempts to adapt would bring their own set of challenges. As the frozen oceans create a landmass of ice, nations might try to exploit this new terrain for resources. However, any attempts to drill or mine beneath the ice would be fraught with danger. The unstable environment, combined with the difficulty of operating in extreme cold, would make such endeavors costly and hazardous. Additionally, competition for resources could lead to conflict, as countries vied for control over whatever scarce materials were left. One of the more chilling possibilities is the feedback loop created by the frozen oceans. As the ice reflects sunlight back into space, the planet would continue to cool. This could plunge Earth into a snowball state, where even land masses would freeze over, leaving only a thin band near the equator, habitable for life. In such a scenario, surviving species, if any, would be forced to adapt rapidly or face extinction. Humanity would need to retreat to this narrow strip of land, relying on technology and ingenuity to eke out a precarious existence. In this frozen world, the concept of seasons would largely vanish. With no ocean currents to drive the cycle of warm and cold, many regions would be locked in unchanging climates. This would have far-reaching effects on agriculture, migration patterns, and even human culture, which has been shaped for millennia by the changing of the seasons. As we look at these grim possibilities, it's clear that the frozen oceans would not only alter life as we know it, but also challenge the very essence of survival itself. In the final part, we'll examine the ultimate fate of this frozen Earth, the potential for recovery, and whether humanity and the planet could ever find a path back to stability. As centuries pass on this frozen Earth, the chances of recovery grow slimmer, and humanity's attempts to adapt become increasingly desperate. The frozen oceans, once vital to the planet's stability, have created an unrelenting and hostile environment. The very essence of Earth's ecosystems has been fundamentally altered, and the possibility of returning to the world as it once was seems more like a distant memory than an achievable reality. One of the most pressing challenges would be humanity's search for sustainable energy. With frozen oceans cutting off access to offshore oil and gas reserves, alternative energy sources would need to be developed and expanded rapidly. Solar power, while viable in equatorial regions, would struggle in areas locked in perpetual cold and cloud cover. Wind energy could offer some relief, but the extreme weather conditions would make maintaining turbines nearly impossible. Efforts to harness geothermal energy might increase, but such ventures would remain limited to specific regions, creating disparities between nations with access to resources and those without. Survival would also hinge on humanity's ability to engineer new agricultural systems. Traditional farming methods would be rendered obsolete as arable land continues to shrink under extreme conditions. Innovations like vertical farming, hydroponics, and lab-grown food would dominate. But these systems require immense energy and technological infrastructure. Many nations would lack the means to implement these solutions, creating a divide between technologically advanced societies and those left behind to fend for themselves. With the oceans now a vast frozen expanse, travel and communication would also evolve in unprecedented ways. Air travel would remain possible, but would require vast amounts of energy and resources. Overland routes across the ice might develop, but they would be fraught with dangers like crevasses and unpredictable ice shifts. In the harshest climates, humanity might retreat into enclosed cities or underground habitats, designed to protect inhabitants from the freezing temperatures and the instability of the surface. Meanwhile, the natural world would continue its slow, silent transformation. In some places, life might adapt to the cold in unexpected ways. Species capable of surviving in extreme conditions, such as microorganisms and cold-adapted insects, could thrive, gradually filling ecological niches left vacant by the disappearance of larger organisms. Over time, entirely new ecosystems could emerge, ones built around the unique challenges of a frozen planet. These new forms of life would bear little resemblance to what once existed, representing a stark reminder of how profoundly the planet has changed. The psychological toll on humanity would be immense. Generations born into this frozen world would know nothing of liquid oceans, green fields, or temperate climates. Cultural expressions would shift to reflect the new reality, with art, music, and literature depicting themes of survival and endurance rather than the natural beauty of a world that no longer exists. Over time, collective memory of Earth's former state might fade, leaving only fragmented stories of a time when the planet was warm and vibrant. Despite these challenges, humanity would likely continue to search for solutions. Scientific efforts might focus on reversing the freeze, using advanced technologies to melt the ice and restore the oceans. However, such attempts would face monumental obstacles, not least the sheer scale of the frozen expanse. Even if technology advanced enough to begin the process, the timeline for success would span centuries or even millennia, far beyond the lifespan of any single generation. The Earth itself, in its frozen state, might stabilize eventually, but at great cost. A frozen planet could sustain some form of life, but it would be a shadow of what once existed. In this stark new reality, humanity's ingenuity, resilience, and ability to adapt would be tested like never before. Whether we would rise to the challenge or succumb to the harshness of this frozen world remains an open question. And so the story of frozen oceans is not just a tale of environmental collapse, but also a testament to the fragile balance of life on Earth. It serves as a reminder of the interconnectedness of our planet's systems and the need to protect them for future generations.